Thank you to everyone tuning in to this important interview. Joining me this morning is a very special guest, Nicky Hager. I'm sure he needs no introduction for those of you in New Zealand, but for those who don't know him, he's the author of 6 books, including The Secret Power and last year's page-turner Dirty Politics. His most recent work is working heavily on examining the Snowden files extensively to analyse New Zealand's role in the Five Eyes Alliance. Nicky, thank you for joining us despite your busy schedule.
Good to be with you, yeah.
I don't suppose you saw that interview last year that came out shortly after you released your book, Dirty Politics, but it was with Paul Henry's daughter, and she didn't seem particularly well versed on the topics of the book. I was wondering if back then and now, after your current revelations, if this is indicative of the current attitude in New Zealand, this kind of complicit and trusting statism.
In fact, I did. Someone sent me the Paul Henry daughter interview. And I thought that when I watched it, I just thought he was a cruel man to insult his daughter like that. Because my general belief is that in every country, there are plenty of intelligent people all the time. And that if you want to look at why policies and politics sometimes seem stupid or people seem to reach bad conclusions, it's not because of ordinary people. It's not because of people's brain size. It's because they're watching the wrong TV or they're listening to the wrong radio stations. They're listening to Paul Henry, for example, and busy with their lives, and they just don't realize that they're being fed unnutritious food. So I think that's a better way to explain it, that when people have good information, in fact, at the heart of democracy is not taking opinion polls and seeing that someone's up or someone's down, or 45% of people say this and 50% say that, because that's pretty meaningless in a democracy if people don't know what they're talking about. The heart of a democracy is where people have information and good information and education, and they're educated from when they're children, and then you have a good debate. And if all that happens and then people make up their minds, that's democracy. But the rest of it's a combination of sort of drifting and political manipulation.
Definitely. And I guess in regards to that, we as a nation, we're particularly passionate people about, let's say, certain topics. And I think a good example would be the recent case of the X Factor scandal. I'm not sure if you've seen it, but the 2 judges were accused of bullying a contestant on national television. And within 24 hours, the whole New Zealand public took to social media to voice their outrage against this scandal. And they signed petitions like on change.org. And so the judges were fired. And yet, but compare this incident with things like the GCSB revelations or the fact that 1 in 4 Kiwi children live in poverty every day. And we don't get particularly vocal about the topics that seem wholly more relevant and important to us. So why do you think that we don't really see similar sorts of actions against those kind of issues compared to something let's say more, not materialistic, but more in the entertainment sector?
So I think your examples illustrate what I was saying very well, that the reason why the X Factor got that attention was because it's getting that attention from the news media and from the promoters and the marketers around it, and the hype and the resources that go into people knowing about it. And of course, we all care about an individual story. We care about our neighbour if they're in trouble and our friend if they're in trouble, so we can relate to that easily, and that makes it easy meat for the sort of the dumb news media to feed on, to give to the public. But when people know about other issues, they're also motivated. For example, even the GCSB, which frankly I write about it, but it's an obscure subject. You know, the secret agency does things which the government denies and other people say they do. But that was, in the last term of the national government, that was the main issue that caught, one of the main issues that did harm for the Prime Minister. And I was asked to speak at a meeting in Auckland about the GCSB bill when it was going through, and the Auckland Town Hall was full to the back seat. And people were being turned away. I've never seen a meeting that big in New Zealand for years. And so what it meant was that when there is the material and the impetus for the media to pay attention to things, in other words, when the public has an opportunity to be part of a debate where there's information and different points of view, people do feel strongly. We feel strongly as a country when there's another country in need. We're extremely generous as a country, giving. We care about war. That's why governments have to hide going to war in New Zealand when they boast about it in Australia or the US. We have a distinctive environment here where people care, political environment, social environment, where people care about things. But if your media is sleepy, if there's not much information around, well then things pass the public by. So I'd say it's always good to look at the structural reasons rather than the and ask the media to look at the structural things rather than to just have that individual stuff.
Definitely. I find that particularly interesting what you said about the meeting that you went to that was full, and yet the election last year saw one of the worst voting numbers in history, and the fact that people didn't really try and change the government that we had in place, considering all the stuff that had come to light about what they'd been up to. And I was just wondering what you thought about that. Is it just a sense of apathy? Like, do we not care? Or
apathy,
is it a similar sort of thing again?
Yeah, it is in a way. Apathy is the word that's used when you're blaming the public for the political system. You mean you're blaming individual by individual, people who actually, why do people not vote? Because they feel alienated from the political system. They feel that they've got no input to it. It's not part of their lives. It doesn't matter to them, which is not the human constitution. We are political animals. And last year's election, I think the more interesting thing is to look at why was it like it was? And taking my book out of the equation, what we had was an election which was, for many people, especially coming from the government that was in the dominant financial and media position, it was a policy-free election. John Key was travelling around the country having selfies taken of himself. And there was no policy coming out, and there was just smiles. And if you were to describe what their election strategy was, it was, don't scare the horses, have nothing going on, quiet it all down, hope that people don't even know there's an election on practically, that they'll just go to the supermarket that morning and won't even notice. Now, people make the mistake that they think that if you have a 3-yearly election, that you live in a democracy and the other countries that don't have elections aren't democracies. But it's not a democracy if you're not having information and real debate and real engagement. And people feel that, and they feel alienated, and they feel that it doesn't matter what they say or think, that the same policies keep going and they don't get any richer and the things they care about don't happen. And so they switch off. In fact, I think that the scariest thing that I've read about in many years about election strategy coming out of the US Republican Party is when clever strategists figure out how to turn off sections of the public so they don't vote as a strategy in gaining their share in the election.
No, that is a scary thought. And it's very true what you said, that a lot of people do feel alienated, because I remember a lot of people I spoke to last year just said that they just weren't going to vote. And I guess because they didn't really know much about the parties, or they just, I guess didn't really know much. And I know that if I'd been old enough to vote, I would definitely have. And it kind of seems a bit unfair that the people who had the right to weren't really using their right. Yeah. I guess in some sense of the...
But the question, so you can say lazy bums, which I partly think, right?
Yeah.
Lazy bums. But you've got to think, why would that be like that? Why don't they care about things? If you talk to them, would they just go, I don't care about anything? I think there's two things. One is what I was saying about not being engaged and just feeling like it's not their business and nobody cares. But another one is go into essentially the right-wing media. Go to the Mike Hoskins of this world, and you see a recurrent philosophical or political action there. And it goes, there's a shrug, and there's a, I don't care, no one cares about this, who cares about this stuff? I don't care about it, I just want to, make money and drive my car.
Yeah.
And why isn't everyone as rich as me? I am a great guy. And if that's so, if there are more people tuning into the public broadcaster who broadcasts that kind of nonsense than there are to the alternative things, well, that's a horrible negative effect. It's kind of like a science fiction that even your public broadcaster is purveying cynicism and indifference to the political system, and then everyone goes, hey, they didn't vote.
Yeah. And now moving on to my next question. One thing I found particularly interesting is your comment in a recent interview that you suspect Junkie doesn't really know much about what the GCSB is actually doing, or much about foreign policy for that matter. So I was hoping you could comment further, because there seems to be this sense among National Party supporters is that he knows what he's doing, he's able to make the right decisions for us, and I think a good example would be the recent case where he sent our troops to go to Iraq and train Iraqi forces, and I think he said something to the lines of get some guts and join the right side. And yet the right side that he's been talking about has been shown to be committing atrocities and revenge acts against Sunni Muslims in Iraq. So in light of this, should we as New Zealanders trust that he knows what he's doing, or that he can make the right decisions? Or is there grave implications, do you think, from these decisions that can affect us in the future?
Oh, joining wars undermines New Zealand terribly and goes against a lot of our character as a nation. So yes, these things really matter. Foreign policy isn't another channel, entertainment channel on the TV. It really matters. What do I think? So this is political commentary from me. I believe that John Key, our current Prime Minister, is a shrewd, effective politician in the sense of negotiating issues and surviving crises and weaving his way around the political crises and things that come along. Credit to him for that. He's good at it. I think that as a person, he did an accountancy degree when he went through university. He's shown through his whole life since then no interest in anything to do with foreign policy, or for that matter to do with music or culture or books or ideas, or I don't think he's ever spent a voluntary day in his life for any cause. He probably doesn't know the names of the trees in his garden, or certainly not in the native bush of the country where he grew up. He's a money man. And so I don't think it's surprising that when he comes into the job that we learn that he sounds like a caricature of just a right-wing politician who, does things like get some guts and go and join a war and our traditional friends are there. Because those are the words that somebody uses when there's no subtlety in their perspective and no reading behind it, no interest in the Middle East, no serious knowledge of what's going on there apart from a briefing paper about how to handle one day's media on something that comes up. And so that's fine, but he doesn't have to be an expert on everything, but we should be able to, we and our media should be able to tell the difference between someone who understands issues and someone who doesn't.
No, exactly. And I found, especially in your another interview, where you stated that he'd tried to stop people from seeking alternative means of media and saying not to read your work or not to read these stories that are coming out. I
find that particularly hilarious, the direction from the Prime Minister. I strongly advise you to disregard what this person is going to tell you about the Snowden documents. I mean, it's weird.
I think the fact is that people would believe him, though, just because he has that position and they're like, oh, well, we've got to do what he says. And I think when I heard you say that, it all gives all the signs of a dictator, and that's what immediately sprung to mind, just this complete kind of dictatorship of the country. Well,
that's the mentality, I think. But the problem is that he's, at the moment he's got a kind of an X factor, celebrity status for some people, and is not really being judged on issues or whether he's good for the economy, for example. I'm not sure his government is good for the economy as it isn't very good for foreign policy, but he's not being judged on that basis by many people. And if they're getting their news from 7 Sharp on TVNZ, then they won't be challenged in that.
No, definitely. Moving on from that, well, it follows on quite nicely. In parliamentary question time, Jonky said there is no difference between what his government is doing and what was put in place by Helen Clark's government, which would come as no surprise to anyone who's seen the Urewera Raids documentary entitled Operation 8. But how much truth is there in this claim, and would it make it less concerning and more acceptable in your eyes if his claim was true?
Well, first of all, I mean, in terms of a moral argument, saying that another government did something isn't a defence of your own actions. You have to defend your own actions on their own terms. Sometimes other governments didn't do a good job either. In terms of surveillance interference with citizens, the GCSB has been spying on the South Pacific and catching New Zealanders in the South Pacific work and the issues I was talking about at that time for a long time. And so that's gone through various governments, and I would criticise the Labour governments for their lack of interest and their lack of oversight and the lack of public debate about these issues, more or less as much as the national governments. But when John Key said nothing has changed under my government, that's where he wasn't accurate, because what our stories were about, this is from coming out of the Snowden documents that we're publishing at the moment, what our stories were about a massive increase in spying under his government. In other words, the story was, we're spying on the South Pacific, that actually isn't new news, but we're spying on the South Pacific on a hugely greater scale. And so the answer, it happened under Helen Clark's government, isn't answering what we were saying. What we were saying was, this has increased immensely in scale. And so he was wrong about that with Helen Clark's government. But what he was trying to say was, or what he was sliding in from one thing to another from, was that her government wasn't that great on intelligence.
No, definitely. I particularly liked your comment in a recent interview about the colonial aspect of the idea that we should be spying on our neighbours, like, as if we have the right to. And I think, and like you said, these Pacific countries that we're spying on are supposed to be friends, like they're friendly nations with us. And yet we openly boast about supplying evidence about them to our Western partners. So I would like to ask you, in a general sense, do you think that spying is necessary? And let's just say if you could sit down with John Key and try and sort it all out, what would you think like the best case scenario would be, to put a halt to spying entirely, or perhaps more transparency?
I think that for most countries in the world do not spy on the internet and do not spy on other countries. It is not the normal state in the world. It is the big powers that do it to gain greater influence in the world. And so when you're a whole country with a population the size of a medium-sized city overseas, the idea that this is a natural thing for us is kind of stretched from the beginning, is unlikely from the beginning. The reason why we spy on the South Pacific states is not because we need the intelligence or we use the intelligence. It is 95% because we are doing it to satisfy our place in the American Intelligence Alliance. So even the debates about how we use the intelligence or whether we need it aren't even relevant, because that's not why we collect the information. We collect it because that is a contribution in what's called the Southwest Pacific Area of Responsibilities that New Zealand has been given in the worldwide spying by the United States. But having said that, we can pause as if it might be rational that we're doing it, and say, when you've got a microstate like Tuvalu, for example, and it's going to go into a negotiation over its fishing industry, which might be like its main resource that it can support itself with and develop with and things. So you've got a tiny little microstate, US powerful fishing industry, and they're dealing with each other, and New Zealand spies on the little country, which is our neighbour and supposed friend, collects the information on negotiations, and gives it to the powerful American companies. Now, what is the moral position in that? What did that have to do with the security of New Zealand, or the safety of New Zealand, or the interests of New Zealand, or justice in the world? It just doesn't stand up. It really doesn't stand up.
No, definitely. And following on from that really nicely is the fact that you said the technology and all the data that gets collected goes straight to the United States. And so by extent, like, they're taking the data of the Pacific, but also data of us in New Zealand. So that's, by and large affecting us as well. So data about us, but in connection with the Pacific, will be going to the States. And I was thinking, so we have on one hand the fact that the government is overstepping their boundaries and breaching people's privacy. But then on the other hand, what assurance do we have that that information is safe from, let's say, other lone wolf or third-party organizations?
The way these big intelligence agencies work, they are very secret. There's big walls around them. And so the GCSB, or hopefully the NSA, I'm not quite so confident there, their information doesn't tend to leak out to private companies or private investigators or things like that. It's too secret, actually. So we need to have sort of a realistic view of what the risks are And in a country like New Zealand, for New Zealanders, first of all, as far as I know, the GCSB does not spy within New Zealand, which is a very good thing and may stay that way. But when we get caught on, when New Zealanders go into an area which is being spied on, like South Pacific, the main defence is that people aren't targets, and I suppose what I would try to explain as a general about surveillance and about civil liberties is that civil liberties don't fall equally. It's when there's a problem with surveillance or a problem with unreasonable police laws or whatever it is. It's not that everyone through society suddenly discovers that they've got problems. Most people's lives go on unchanged. But that doesn't make it all right. There'll be some sector of society which is taking the brunt of it. It might be the war on terror years, and so it's Muslim people are having the problem, or whatever it is. And so you have to look at the actual people who are being hurt by it. And at this stage, the main people being hurt by GCSB spying are other countries, actually. And I would argue that New Zealanders shouldn't get too fired up about it.
And just as one of my last points, for those people who are interested in keen...
fired up for themselves is what I was saying, but sorry.
Oh, okay, yeah. No, that's okay. So for those people who are keen to learn more and are, keen followers of this kind of information, do you have any kind of hints or something about what's to come?
On the Snowden revelations?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, we're about halfway through releasing the information, and the next story, which is coming out tomorrow, I don't know when it's being broadcast, but the next story that's coming out is about what New Zealand uses the system for. So we spy on this staggering array of countries, or help spy on them, as our part of the alliance. And the next story that's coming out is a really, I think, amazing, shocking story about what the national government decided to do with this system for its own benefits. And so it had access to this worldwide surveillance system where it could spy on pretty much the whole internet. And the question is, what would they use this for? What cause, what principle, what value in the world would they use this for? And that's what the next story is going to be about. Oh,
that's great. I look forward to reading that. So in terms of that, for people who are interested, where can they go, and what sorts of people can they talk to I guess learn more and that kind of thing? Like, what kind of news sites would you recommend that they follow?
Well, for New Zealand news, it's always worth going to the Herald site or somewhere in New Zealand to know what's going, because we show what's going on day to day. But for actually thought-provoking things, the great thing about the internet is that blogs allow good analysis that doesn't make its way into mainstream media. And I would recommend for New Zealand politics a blog with a funny name. It's called the DIM Post, D-I-M Post. That's intelligent commentary about New Zealand politics. And for commentary around the world, we really should just get on the internet and read the overseas news, which has much more resources than New Zealand stuff can ever have. I'm working at the moment with The Intercept, who've got the Snowden papers but writing about other issues. I'm very impressed with the work that they are doing. And so I would recommend people go on The Intercept. It's very sort of biased towards intelligence at the moment because of the Snowden papers, and intelligence is not the most important issue on earth. It's just one of the issues that we should care about as part of the bigger picture of foreign policy. But that's a very good site, and then there's The Guardian and so on. I think if people go out into the world and bother to look regularly at good news sites, it changes your life.
Thank you so much for doing this.
No,
it was great to talk to you.
Great questions. Yes. Okay.
But that's just language, really. Like, if I sort of beating up someone with a variety of weaponry and they're jabbing me with a pin, it's like, the pin technique, you're an animal!